There's a moment, they never tell you about this moment, where you're sitting alone in a room with a name you've been given, and everything that comes next is completely your choice. And you've already decided. You decided before the envelope arrived. That's what they selected you for. The CIA does not hire assassins the way you're imagining. There's no dark website, no shadow broker, no handoff in a parking garage. What there is a selection process so specific, so psychologically precise, that by the time they approach you, you've already been living the profile for years without knowing it. Today, we're walking through what that profile is, what it feels like to be inside it, and what it costs. The CIA's psychological research, parts of which became public through Senate Intelligence Committee findings in the 1970s, identified something counterintuitive about what makes an effective covert operator. It's not aggression. It's not ideology. It's not even exceptional skill, though skill matters. It's a very specific empathy range, high enough to read people accurately, low enough that reading them doesn't cost you anything. That combination, functional empathy without emotional cost, is rarer than any combat qualification. The people selected for this work almost always report the same thing when asked about the recruitment approach. It didn't feel like a recruitment. It felt like a recognition, like someone had seen them clearly for the first time. That's not an accident. The approach is engineered to feel that way, because the profile they're looking for is someone who has spent their life slightly outside every group they've belonged to. Competent, trusted, but never fully inside. The Church Committee, the Senate investigation that publicly documented CIA covert operations in 1975, revealed something that still reads as extraordinary. The agency had been running formal psychological profiling programs since the early 1950s. Programs designed not just to screen candidates, but to identify them years before recruitment. To find people who fit the profile before those people knew a profile existed. The feeling of being seen is manufactured, and it works. Every time. The distance between you and the person who authorized the operation is not an accident. It's documented design, the presidential finding. A legal mechanism that became public knowledge through the Church Committee creates a paper authorization chain that protects every level above you. By the time an operation reaches you, it has been filtered through at least 4 institutional layers. You are the only person in that chain with no institutional protection if something goes wrong. Your handling officer is the entire human infrastructure of your professional existence. They are your only contact point with the agency. They deliver the assignment and receive confirmation of completion. That's the relationship, not friendship, not mentorship. A single conduit maintained at maximum distance from emotion, because emotional connection is a security vulnerability. The agency understands this even if you eventually stop understanding it. Plausible deniability, a term the Church Committee made public, is not a loophole. It's architecture. The distance between you and the authorization chain is carefully calibrated so that in any scenario where you are exposed, the institutional relationship genuinely cannot be proven. The agency isn't lying when it denies you. They designed the relationship so the denial is technically true. You are not an employee. You are not even legally an agent. You are a gap in the record. The operational periods are not the hard part. Operational focus is clean. There are parameters, a timeline, a clear definition of success. What's hard, what the psychological literature on covert operators consistently identifies as the primary source of long-term damage, is the time between operations. The weeks or months where you are technically a private citizen, living an ordinary life, performing ordinariness for everyone around you. You develop what researchers who study covert operators describe as compartmentalization fatigue, not from the work itself, but from the maintenance of a false life around it. Every relationship becomes a performance. Every conversation is a management task. You become extraordinarily good at the surface of human connection while losing access to any depth of it. The people who know you best know you least. That inversion is survivable for years. Then it becomes the thing that ends you, not the operations, the performance. This isn't speculation. The CIA's own research, portions declassified through FOIA requests, uses the clinical term identity erosion for what happens to long-term covert operators. Not a dramatic breakdown, a gradual narrowing. The authentic self becomes harder to locate. Not because it was destroyed, but because the performance of an alternative self runs so continuously that finding the original requires effort you're not always sure is worth making. You start to wonder if the person you were before the work was ever really you at all. That question is not answerable from inside the career, only from outside it. And outside it is very far away. The Church Committee, formerly the Senate Select Committee to Study Governmental Operations with Respect to Intelligence Activities, produced findings in 1975 that remain the most detailed public accounting of CIA covert action ever published. Among the documented findings, the agency had operated programs targeting foreign leaders for assassination. The programs were real. The authorization chains were real. And when they became public, the agency's response was a masterclass in institutional distance. Disavowal is the operational term for what happens when a contractor is exposed and the agency exercises the distance it built into the relationship from the beginning. Officially, you never existed in that role. The relationship cannot be documented because it was designed to be undocumentable. You are not being lied about, which is almost worse. You are simply not provable. The system that selected you, that ran you, that paid you, it functions exactly as designed when it removes you. You were always contingent. The disavowal was always the exit plan they had for you, even when they hadn't planned to use it. The Church Committee documented 3 recurring patterns in how the agency managed contractors when operations went wrong, or relationships became untenable. The scapegoat pattern, where a contractor is publicly identified as acting without authorization, regardless of whether that's true. The silence pattern, where mutual disappearance serves both parties' interests. And a third pattern that the committee documented in internal terminology, but whose outcomes were rarely recorded in any public-facing document. The third pattern is why the other 2 patterns are almost always accepted. The compensation is real, the financial freedom is real, but the psychological literature, including research that became public through Senate oversight, identifies a consistent pattern in long-term contractors. The skills that make them effective become inseparable from the deficits they accumulate. The ability to compartmentalize that lets you function operationally is the same ability that prevents you from maintaining authentic human connection. You become very good at a very specific thing, everything adjacent. The CIA's own psychological research, portions declassified through FOIA requests, uses the clinical term identity erosion for what happens to long-term covert operators. Not a dramatic breakdown, a gradual narrowing. The authentic self becomes harder to locate, not because it was destroyed, but because the performance of an alternative self runs so continuously that finding the original requires effort you're not always sure is worth making. You start to wonder if the person you were before the work was ever really you at all. That question is not answerable from inside the career, only from outside it. And outside it is very far away. The job didn't take anything from you, you gave it away voluntarily. For a price you thought was fair at the time. Exit is not symmetrical. You didn't choose when to enter, they chose you. And in most documented cases, you don't choose when to leave. The voluntary withdrawal, where a contractor completes a career, retires on their terms, and transitions to a quiet private life, exists. But the Senate Intelligence Committee's findings suggest it's the exception, not the pattern. The more common exits are managed by the agency, not the contractor. And the management is not designed with your well-being as the primary variable. The psychological exit, where the agency determines that a contractor's operational effectiveness has degraded past the threshold, is almost always experienced by the contractor as a relief they didn't know they needed. The performance stops being required. For the first time in years, no role is needed. The cost of that relief is that you didn't control it. You were retired the way a resource is retired when the cost of maintaining you exceeded your output. The third pattern, documented but rarely specified, simply ends contact. The handling officer becomes unreachable. The relationship, which was always designed to be deniable, is denied. Right now, not in history, not in fiction, there are people inside this exact psychological structure. People who were selected because they fit a profile they didn't know existed, who are maintained in a role they cannot discuss, who will exit that role when the system decides, not when they do. The CIA's covert action programs, documented publicly since 1975, have never stopped. The oversight has changed. The architecture has not. If this video landed differently than you expected, if it felt less like a spy thriller and more like something uncomfortably close, that's not an accident. The next video breaks down the specific psychological assessments used in covert contractor selection, the actual tests, the scores that matter, the traits that qualify you without your knowledge. If that's something you want to understand, you already know where to find us. And if anyone asks what you've been watching, you don't remember.